It started like any other school day in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Kids hurried through the lunchroom line, their trays clattering as the familiar smells of cafeteria food filled the air. Laughter and chatter echoed off the walls, blending into a comforting symphony of youth and innocence. But not every moment in that lunchroom was so carefree, at least not for little Ava. Ava, an 8-year-old girl with a big, bright smile and a love for peanut butter sandwiches, had always been the kind of kid to bring sunshine wherever she went. But over the past few weeks, her sunny disposition had started to dim. Her friends noticed it first: her reluctance to eat, the way she carefully picked at the food on her tray, and the quiet glances she cast toward the cafeteria staff. Something wasn't right. The school's lunch lady, Mrs. Gleason, was a familiar face to everyone. A middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair, tied back in a bun, and a no-nonsense attitude. She was known for her strict rules, but most students believed she had a kind heart underneath her stern demeanor. That's why what happened next shocked everyone. Ava's friends, Kayla and Jasmine, had been growing more concerned by the day. They noticed that Ava's food was often different from theirs. While they were served fresh, steaming meals, Ava would end up with cold, stale items, barely edible and far from what the other kids received. It didn't make sense. Why was she being treated differently? Maybe it's just a mistake, Kayla whispered one afternoon as the three of them sat together at their usual lunch table. Ava shrugged, her eyes downcast as she poked at a dried-out piece of bread. But Jasmine wasn't convinced. She had been paying attention, and this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was happening daily. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Kayla and Jasmine hatched a plan. Armed with nothing but their school tablets, they decided to start recording their lunchtime experiences. It wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about finding out the truth. The next day, as the lunch line formed, Kayla stood a few students behind Ava, her tablet camera subtly angled to capture everything. She watched closely as Mrs. Gleason handed out trays. For every student, the portions were the same: fresh fruit, hot entrees, and neatly arranged side dishes. But when Ava approached the counter, everything changed. Mrs. Gleason's expression stiffened, and her hands moved differently, almost deliberately. Ava's tray was filled with leftovers, food that looked like it had been sitting out far too long. Kayla's heart raced as she caught it all on camera. Jasmine, waiting at their table, did her part too, snapping a quick photo of their trays side by side once Ava returned. The difference was undeniable. But why? Why was Mrs. Gleason treating Ava this way? Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Each time, Kayla and Jasmine collected more evidence. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Was this a misunderstanding? Or was something much darker happening behind the scenes? The final straw came on a rainy Friday afternoon. Ava had barely touched her food all week, and the sadness in her eyes was unmistakable. As the girls sat together, reviewing their recordings, Kayla paused one of the videos. Her finger hovered over the screen, pointing to something in the background. A fleeting moment that might hold the key to everything. "You see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jasmine leaned in, her eyes widening as realization dawned. They had the proof they needed, but now came the hard part: deciding what to do with it. Their hearts pounded as they realized the weight of their discovery. What started as a simple question about Ava's lunch had spiraled into something much bigger, something they couldn't ignore. And so, with courage they didn't know they had, the girls made a decision that would change everything. What they uncovered next was more shocking than they could have ever imagined, leaving their entire school and the community reeling. Kayla and Jasmine spent the entire weekend huddled together in Jasmine's room, poring over their recordings and photos. Ava had been reluctant at first, hesitant to talk about what was happening, but her friends had gently reassured her. "We're not trying to get anyone in trouble," Jasmine had said softly. "We just want to make things fair. You deserve to eat the same food as everyone else." Ava finally opened up. She told them about how it all began, small things at first. A tray with fewer options than her classmates, a piece of fruit that was too bruised to eat, bread that was hard as a rock. She had thought maybe she was imagining it, that she'd just been unlucky, but after weeks of the same treatment, she couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't want to say anything, Ava admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought maybe I'd get in trouble, or that no one would believe me. Kayla's heart ached hearing Ava's words. She looked at her friend, whose big brown eyes were filled with worry, and she felt a surge of determination. Ava shouldn't have to deal with this alone. They were in this together now. But the more they watched the videos, the more they realized they still didn't have answers. Sure, they could see what was happening. Mrs. Gleason consistently giving Ava the worst food, but they had no idea why. Was it personal? Or was there some other reason behind it? Jasmine's mom worked late shifts at the hospital, so the girls had the house to themselves that Saturday night. They spread out their evidence on the kitchen table, photos, notes, timestamps from the videos, and tried to piece everything together. Jasmine, always the planner, grabbed a notebook and started writing down questions. Asterisk, asterisk, why Ava? What changed recently? Does Mrs. Gleason treat other kids like this too, asterisk, asterisk? Maybe we should talk to someone, Kayla suggested, chewing on the end of her pen. Like a teacher or the principal. But what if they don't believe us? Jasmine countered. We need more proof. Something that shows this isn't just a coincidence. Ava sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. I don't want her to lose her job, she murmured. Even if she's being mean, what if she has kids? Or a family she's taken care of? Her words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. Ava's kindness, even towards someone who had been treating her unfairly, made Kayla and Jasmine even more determined to handle this the right way. By Sunday evening, they had come up with a plan. They needed more information, and they were going to find it. Jasmine remembered hearing her older cousin talk about how schools sometimes had rules for how cafeteria staff served food. If they could figure out those rules, they might understand whether Mrs. Gleason was breaking them. And if she was, they'd have a stronger case when they eventually spoke up. Kayla volunteered to do some research online, while Jasmine promised to pay closer attention in the cafeteria over the next week. Ava, still nervous about everything, agreed to keep sitting with them and letting them document her lunches. They decided to take things one step at a time. When Monday rolled around, the girls were ready. Kayla brought her tablet to school, pretending to be interested in a new game during lunch while secretly recording from her tray. Jasmine, sitting across from her, kept an eye on the lunch line. And Ava, as always, was at the center of it all, trying her best to act like nothing was wrong. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual energy, kids laughing and trading snacks. But the three friends were laser-focused. Kayla noticed something almost immediately. Mrs. Gleason wasn't just treating Ava differently. She was smiling and chatting with other students. But when Ava stepped up to the counter, her demeanor changed. She barely looked at Ava, her movements curt and mechanical as she served the food. The difference was striking. Did you see that? Kayla whispered to Jasmine when Ava sat down. Jasmine nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I think I saw her pick up a different tray just for Ava, Jasmine said. Like she had it set aside or something. They continued their observations all week, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Ava's food was consistently worse. Stale bread, mushy vegetables, lukewarm untrees. And every time Mrs. Gleason's behavior was the same. It was clear this wasn't an accident. But why? On Thursday, something unexpected happened. As Kayla recorded the lunch line again, she noticed another student, a boy named Malik, stepping up to the counter. He was in Ava's grade, but they weren't close friends. Like Ava, Malik was quiet and kept to himself. Kayla watched closely as Mrs. Gleason served him, and her stomach dropped. The food on his tray looked just as bad as Ava's. Jasmine, Kayla hissed later, showing her the footage. It's not just Ava. Jasmine frowned. So it's not personal. What's the connection then? They didn't have to wonder for long. That same afternoon during recess, Jasmine overheard a group of kids talking near the swings. One of them mentioned how Malik had been getting weird looks from some of the teachers lately, especially after his mom had come to school last week to talk about an issue with his grades. "I think Mrs. Gleason doesn't like kids whose parents complain," the boy said, his tone conspiratorial. "My cousin said she's been like that for years." Jasmine's eyes widened as she ran back to Kayla and Ava to tell them what she'd heard. Suddenly, things started to make sense. Was Mrs. Gleason targeting kids whose families had spoken up about problems at school? If so, this was more than just a personal grudge. It was a pattern of unfair treatment. The discovery added a new layer to their mystery, but it also made things more complicated. If Mrs. Gleason really was treating certain kids differently because of their parents, how could they prove it? And how many other students had been affected? By Friday, the girls felt like they were onto something big, but they still didn't have all the pieces. They decided to expand their investigation, quietly asking other classmates about their experiences with Mrs. Gleason. Most kids shrugged and said they hadn't noticed anything unusual, but a few mentioned seeing Ava's food and thinking it looked gross or weird. One boy even joked, "Maybe she doesn't like you, Ava." The comment stung, but Ava didn't let it show. Instead, she focused on helping her friends figure out their next steps. They were getting closer to the truth. She could feel it. But with each new piece of evidence, the weight of their discovery grew heavier. What if they were wrong? What if speaking up only made things worse? That afternoon, as the final bell rang and the students poured out of the school, Kayla turned to Ava and Jasmine. "We're going to figure this out," she said firmly. "No matter what." And as they walked home together, their minds raced with questions, plans, and the undeniable sense that they were on the brink of something big, something that would change their lives and their school forever. The following Monday, the girls arrived at school feeling both determined and nervous. They knew they were getting closer to uncovering the truth, but it also felt like they were walking a fine line. If they made the wrong move or confronted the wrong person too soon, everything they had worked for could come crashing down. Jasmine suggested a new approach. "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way," she said as they sat on the swings during morning recess. "What if it's not just about parents complaining? What if it's something else? Like who she thinks is important, or who she can get away with treating badly?" Ivor glanced at her friends but didn't say anything. She was glad they cared so much, but deep down, part of her just wanted this to be over. Every day in the lunchroom felt harder, especially now that she knew other kids were starting to notice. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about how small and different it made her feel. Meanwhile, Kayla couldn't stop replaying everything they'd seen and heard. Her mind darted from theory to theory, none of them quite fitting. She had spent the weekend reading about school cafeteria policies and food safety rules, even printing out a list of guidelines to keep in her backpack. If Mrs. Gleason was breaking any of those rules, they could use that to get help. But so far, nothing seemed clear-cut. That day at lunch, the tension reached a boiling point. The cafeteria was especially loud, the room buzzing with energy as kids swapped stories about the weekend. Kayla tried to blend in as she positioned her tablet again, determined to capture more footage without drawing attention. Jasmine sat beside Ava, giving her an encouraging nudge as they joined the line. But when Ava stepped up to the counter, something new happened. Mrs. Gleason paused, glancing at her before turning back to the food trays. For a brief moment, Kayla thought she saw hesitation in the lunch lady's expression, but it was gone in an instant. Instead of her usual cold demeanor, Mrs. Gleason leaned down slightly and said in a low voice, "If you don't like the food, you can bring your own lunch." The words were quiet, but they hit like a slap. Ava froze, her cheeks burning as she muttered a quick "okay" and grabbed her tray. Kayla and Jasmine exchanged a look, their anger bubbling under the surface. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about the way Mrs. Gleason seemed to be trying to put Ava in her place, to make her feel like she didn't belong. When they sat down at their usual table, Ava didn't say a word. Jasmine fumed, slamming her juice box on the table a little harder than she meant to. "She did that on purpose," Jasmine hissed. "She's trying to make you feel bad so you'll stop coming to her line." Ava shrugged, picking at the stale piece of bread on her tray. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I should just bring lunch from home." Kayla leaned forward, her voice firm. "No, that's not the point, Ava. You shouldn't have asterisk to do that. Everyone else gets decent food. Why shouldn't you?" Jasmine nodded in agreement, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not giving up now. We're going to figure out what's going on, and we're going to fix it. I don't care how long it takes." The rest of the week passed in a blur of observations and whispered conversations. Kayla noticed more patterns in Mrs. Gleason's behavior. How she was friendlier with kids who were popular or whose parents were involved in school events. Meanwhile, Ava continued to receive subpar food, though Mrs. Gleason seemed to be growing more cautious, perhaps sensing that someone was watching. On Thursday, something unexpected happened. As Jasmine sat in class, she overheard her teacher, Mrs. Morales, talking to another staff member in the hallway. They were discussing the upcoming school inspection, a routine check to ensure everything, from lesson plans to cafeteria operations, was up to standard. Jasmine's ears perked up when she heard Mrs. Morales mention Mrs. Gleason. "She's been here so long, she probably thinks she can do whatever she wants," Mrs. Morales said with a laugh. "But they'll be looking at everything, including food quality." Jasmine's mind raced. If the inspection was coming up, maybe they could use it to their advantage. If the inspectors saw what Mrs. Gleason was doing, or even just noticed the poor quality of Ava's meals, they might step in without the girls having to say anything. That afternoon, Jasmine shared what she had overheard with Kayla and Ava. Kayla's eyes lit up with excitement. "This could be it," she said. "If we can just make sure they see how unfairly she's treating you, they'll have to do something about it." But Ava didn't look as thrilled. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "What if it backfires?" she asked quietly. "What if Mrs. Gleason figures out it's because of us and starts being even worse?" Jasmine reached out to squeeze Ava's hand. "We won't let that happen," she promised. "We'll make sure they see what's going on without it pointing back to you. And besides, you're not the only one she's been unfair to, remember? This isn't just about you, it's about doing what's right." Over the next few days, the girls prepared carefully. Kayla made sure her tablet was fully charged, ready to capture anything suspicious during the inspection. Jasmine kept an ear out for more details about when the inspectors would be visiting, while Ava tried to stay hopeful, though her nerves were growing by the day. Finally, the day of the inspection arrived. The atmosphere in the school was noticeably different. Teachers were on edge, students were extra quiet, and the cafeteria staff moved with more urgency than usual. Kayla, Jasmine, and Ava sat at their usual table, trying to act normal as they waited for the inspectors to arrive. When they finally did, the tension in the room was palpable. Two people in suits walked in, clipboards in hand, their eyes scanning the room as they began making notes. Mrs. Gleason's demeanor changed instantly. She plastered on a wide smile and moved with exaggerated care, her every action designed to look perfect. The girls watched in frustration as Mrs. Gleason served tray after tray of fresh, neatly prepared food. It was as if the past few weeks had never happened. Even Ava's tray looked normal for once, though the strained look on Mrs. Gleason's face as she handed it over told a different story. "She's putting on a show," Jasmine muttered under her breath. "She knows they're watching." Kayla nodded, her fingers tightening around her tablet. "We just have to wait. People like her can't hide forever." As the inspectors moved through the lunchroom, taking notes and speaking quietly to each other, the girls couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, just waiting to be uncovered. But whether they would find it in time remained to be seen. The cafeteria buzzed with a nervous energy as the inspectors continued their rounds, their sharp eyes missing nothing. Mrs. Gleason's overly cheerful demeanor didn't fool the girls. They knew she was putting on an act. Every movement of hers was calculated, from the perfectly arranged trays to the warm smile she gave each student. It was all too rehearsed, and Kayla could barely contain her frustration. "She's hiding everything," Kayla whispered to Jasmine as they sat at their table. "How are they supposed to see the real her when she's acting like this?" Jasmine frowned, her mind racing. "There has to be a way to show them the truth," she said. "We just need a moment where she slips up. Something that she can't fake." Ava, sitting quietly with her tray, looked down at the food in front of her. For once, it didn't look stale or cold, but the gesture felt hollow. She couldn't shake the unease in her stomach, the fear that they might fail, that nothing would change, and that Mrs. Gleason would go back to treating her the way she always had. The inspectors eventually made their way toward Mrs. Gleason, who greeted them with a warm smile and gestured toward the food preparation area. The girls watched intently as she led them behind the counter, talking animatedly about the cafeteria's procedures and the care she claimed to put into serving the students. "She's trying to distract them," Jasmine muttered. "She's not going to let them see anything real." But then something unexpected happened. One of the inspectors, a tall man with glasses and a no-nonsense expression, stopped mid-conversation and turned his attention to the food trays. He picked up one of them, examining it closely before gesturing for Mrs. Gleason to explain. Kayla and Jasmine leaned forward, straining to hear the conversation from across the room. Mrs. Gleason's smile faltered slightly as she launched into a long-winded explanation about food quality and supply chains, but the inspector didn't look convinced. Instead, he motioned for his partner to take notes. "Do you think they're catching on?" Ava asked quietly, her voice tinged with hope and anxiety. "Maybe," Kayla said, gripping her tablet tightly. "But we can't just sit here. We have to do something to make sure they see the truth." Jasmine nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Let's go," she said, standing up and motioning for the others to follow her. Together, they made their way to the edge of the lunch line, positioning themselves close enough to observe without drawing too much attention. As they watched, the inspectors continued asking questions, occasionally glancing at Mrs. Gleason with skeptical expressions. But the lunch lady was nothing if not practiced. She deflected each inquiry with ease, her voice steady and confident. It wasn't until one of the inspectors asked about how food was allocated to the students that the tension in the room truly shifted. Mrs. Gleason hesitated for a split second, her eyes flickering toward the line of kids waiting for their trays. It was a small moment, but it was enough to make Kayla's heart race. "She knows," Kayla whispered urgently. "She knows they're onto something." Jasmine's eyes narrowed as she pulled out her phone. "If she's going to slip, it's going to happen now," she said. "We need to be ready." The next few minutes felt like hours as the inspectors continued their questioning. Kayla kept her tablet recording, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady the camera. Ava stood silently beside her friends, her chest tight with a mix of fear and anticipation. And then it happened. A boy near the back of the line, a shy, soft-spoken student named Amir, stepped up to the counter. Mrs. Gleason's expression changed instantly, her cheerful facade giving way to a look of annoyance. Without missing a beat, she grabbed a tray from the far side of the counter, a tray that had clearly been set aside, and handed it to Amir without making eye contact. The girls watched in shock as Amir hesitated, looking down at the unappealing food on his tray. He opened his mouth as if to say something but quickly closed it, lowering his head and walking away. The inspectors, who had been in the middle of another question, paused at the sight. "What was that?" the man with glasses asked, his tone sharp. Mrs. Gleason froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Oh, that," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "That tray must have been an accident. Sometimes things get mixed up, you know how it is." But the inspectors didn't look convinced. The man turned to his partner, who nodded and began taking more notes. Across the room, Kayla and Jasmine exchanged a triumphant glance. "She slipped," Jasmine said under her breath. She finally slipped. Ava, still watching the scene unfold, felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe this was it. Maybe the inspectors would see what they had been trying to prove all along. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Mrs. Gleason regained her composure, smoothly redirecting the inspector's attention to another part of the cafeteria. The girls' victory felt fleeting, like a small crack in an otherwise impenetrable wall. Still, they weren't ready to give up. As the inspectors continued their tour, Kayla stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the man with glasses. The inspector turned, his expression softening as he looked down at the young girl standing before him. "Yes?" he asked gently. Kayla took a deep breath, glancing at Jasmine and Eva for support before speaking. "I think you should see this," she said, holding out her tablet. "We've been recording something important." The inspector's eyes widened slightly as he took the device, scrolling through the footage. The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter as he watched, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, perhaps, or maybe determination. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll look into this." As the girls stepped back, their hearts racing, they knew they had taken a risk. But they also knew it was worth it. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no turning back now. The inspector's calm but serious acknowledgement gave the girls a flicker of hope, but their relief was short-lived. As the trio returned to their table, they couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Kayla kept glancing toward Mrs. Gleason, who was back to serving students with her usual forced smile, as if nothing had happened. Ava quietly picked at her lunch, her nerves still on edge. But Jasmine, always the boldest of the group, was restless. "Do you think that's it?" she whispered. "Do you think they'll actually do something with what we showed them?" Kayla hesitated, clutching her tablet tightly. "I don't know," she admitted, "but at least they're aware now. That's more than we had before." Before Jasmine could respond, a sudden commotion near the cafeteria doors caught their attention. The principal, Mrs. Price, strode into the room, her sharp heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Her expression was calm, but the tension in her shoulders hinted at something more. She approached the inspectors, exchanging a few quiet words with them before turning her attention to Mrs. Gleason. The girls watched as Mrs. Price gestured toward the kitchen, her tone polite but firm. Mrs. Gleason hesitated, glancing at the line of students still waiting to be served. For a moment, it looked like she might refuse, but then she nodded and followed Mrs. Price and the inspectors out of sight. "What do you think they're talking about?" Ava asked, a voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe they're asking her about the trays," Jasmine guessed, "or the way she treated Damar." Kayla frowned, her mind racing. What if she lies? What if she says it was just a mistake, or tries to blame it on someone else? Ava shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the kitchen doors. What if she blames us? The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. None of them wanted to admit it, but Ava had a point. If Mrs. Gleason suspected they were the ones who had tipped off the inspectors, there was no telling what she might do. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the lunchroom buzzed with speculation. Whispers spread among the students like wildfire, everyone wondering why the inspectors had arrived and why Mrs. Price had pulled Mrs. Gleason aside. The tension was almost unbearable, and the girls couldn't help but feel like they were sitting on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see whether they would be pushed off or pulled back to safety. Finally, the kitchen doors swung open, and Mrs. Gleason emerged. But instead of returning to her station, she walked straight past the serving line and out of the cafeteria, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Price and the inspectors followed a few steps behind her, their faces somber but determined. "What just happened?" Jasmine asked, a voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. "I don't know," Kayla replied, her eyes fixed on the scene, "but something's definitely going on." As the girls sat in silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed, an unexpected sound broke through the din of the cafeteria, a soft but insistent vibration. Kayla looked down at her tablet, which was still in her lap, and realized that she had received a message. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the notification. It was from an anonymous sender, but the subject line was chilling. Asterisk, you think you're so smart, don't you? Asterisk. Kayla's hands trembled as she opened the message. The body of the email was short but threatening. Asterisk, stay out of it, or you'll regret it. Asterisk, there was no signature, no hint of who might have sent it, but the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. What is it? Jasmine asked, noticing the sudden change in Kayla's expression. Kayla hesitated, glancing around the cafeteria before showing the message to her friends. Jasmine's eyes widened as she read it, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of doubt. Iva's face paled, and she instinctively drew closer to her friends, as if seeking protection. This has to be from her, Jasmine said, her voice low but urgent. She knows we're the ones who recorded her. But how? Iva asked, her voice trembling. We didn't say anything. We didn't tell anyone. Kayla shook her head, her mind racing. It doesn't matter how she knows. What matters is that she's trying to scare us. She wants us to back off. Are we going to? Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening with resolve. No, she said firmly. If anything, this proves we're getting close. She wouldn't try to intimidate us if she wasn't scared. Kayla nodded slowly, though the fear gnawing at her stomach was hard to ignore. We just have to be careful, she said. We can't let her see us coming. The rest of the school day passed in a blur, the girls unable to focus on anything but the events of the lunchroom. By the time the final bell rang, they had come up with a plan. They would dig deeper, gathering as much evidence as they could to ensure that the truth couldn't be ignored. But they also knew they had to be cautious. Whoever had sent that message was watching, and the stakes were higher than ever. As they left the school building, the weight of the day settled over them like a heavy blanket. The truth was out there, tantalizingly close, but so were the risks. And as the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped below the horizon, the girls couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning.